Part 2 of this chapter gave an overview of the Buddhist concept of not-self. Here in this supplement, I'll continue the analysis of what the Buddha taught and how doctrine developed, both necessary to understand what essential Buddhism is, if by that we mean what the Buddha taught. I'll cover both the seed scriptures in the Pali Canon and the evolution of thought about self and the afterlife. To make the review easier to digest, I've broken it into several short sections. Written and produced by Thomas Tai Seal. Copyright Thomas Tai Seal unless otherwise noted. When the Buddha spoke of self, he typically used the word translated to Sanskrit as Atman or Atta in Pali. There are two levels of understanding Atman, an everyday language meaning usually related to one's body, mind, or character, individual identity, or professional roles. And secondly, a technical theological meaning that self is a divine reality, the timeless, undying Atman Brahman resident inside us as our inner self, as revealed in the early Upanishads. The early Upanishads had been transmitted orally within Vedic schools and circulated among the priestly class 100 years or more before the Buddha. The Buddha had thoughts about both meanings of the word Atman. As we saw in the last section, the Buddha identified 5 components which we typically identify with self. In Buddhism, these are known as the 5 aggregates. Form, for us that would be our body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Listing these as components of what we often think of as self is not particularly revolutionary. It's a reasonable list. The Buddha taught, however, that we are not any one of these aggregates. He explained the reason why with the rhetorical question. Is what is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change fit to be regarded thus? This is mine, this I am, this is myself? The intended answer, of course, is no, because our form, that is our body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness is ever-changing. These impermanent physical and mental occurrences cannot be self because we think of self as something stable. Rather, these aggregates are the essence of change, some passing through us rapidly, like a never-ending stream. This cannot be self, as is nothing stable about them. When we consider carefully, we see that each aggregate reflects, this is not mine, this is not what I am, this is not myself. That makes sense. So that also is not particularly revolutionary. What is revolutionary are some of the claims about self and not self made by some of the Buddhist schools that arose about the time of the Second Buddhist Council, 100 years after the Buddha's death. Recall that at this council, Buddhist communities from various locales came to realize that they had different views about what the Buddha meant on numerous important subjects, and that a small group known as the Way of the Elders, the Svaviravada in Sanskrit, hereafter referred to simply as the Elders, split off from the greater group which then became known as the Mahasamgika, the Great Community. As mentioned earlier, whether either group correctly presented the Buddha's teachings is up for debate. As mentioned briefly earlier, from these two groups, the Svaviravada and the Mahasamgika, 18 schools are said to have emerged, 12 from the Svaviravada lineage and 6 from the Mahasamgika. The chart here, generated by AI, lists and briefly summarizes the different positions on self when these different views first emerged. We'll take a closer look at some of these in this supplement. For now, suffice it to say that views about what not self means differed. Vigorous debate continues even now about what it means. We can see the debate play out in what may be considered an infamous verse in the Pali Canon, infamous in that it generated more questions than answers. In the connected discourse, a story is recounted of a Buddhist nun who, while relaxing in a grove of trees, was confronted by Mara, the personification of temptation, delusion, and death. Mara asked the nun, "By whom was this being, the nun, created? Where is the being's maker? Where has the being arisen? Where does the being cease?" After gathering her senses, the nun responded, "You believe there is a being, Mara. This is a heap of sheer fabrications. Here no being is found. Just as, with an assemblage of parts, the word chariot is used, so when the aggregates exist, there is the convention a being. It is only suffering that comes to be, suffering that stands and falls away. Nothing but suffering comes to be. Nothing but suffering ceases." The first thing to notice is that this is a story about a nun apparently being told by Ananda, a favored disciple of the Buddha. It's not a sermon of the Buddha. Also of note is that the word translated here as being is the Pali word sata, not the word atta, which means self. In historical Hindu context, atta is a theologically loaded term with metaphysical connotations. Sata is more neutral and usually refers to everyday beings. That distinction between the word for being and the word for self is telling. The verses may have nothing at all to do with affirming or rejecting the doctrine of self. Reinforcing the view that these verses intend no theological assertion about self is the last verse, which, rather than answer the demon's question, the nun simply reverts to teaching the Buddha's message that to us ordinary beings, suffering rises and falls, which is, of course, a truncated representation of the Buddha's teaching about dependent origination, accepted by all branches of Buddhism. That could be it. In essence, the story may just mean, forget all the speculation about where being comes from, just focus on not clinging to views which cause suffering. That, I think, is a very fair understanding. The verses do, however, invite speculation about other possible meanings, perhaps an ill-advised endeavor, as just noted. What should not concern us is whether the verses are saying that beings don't exist. Of course they exist. We who are viewing and reading this are beings, and the Buddha spoke of individual beings, that is, people, all the time. The verse seems to be making this clear when it says, "So, when the aggregates exist, there is the convention a being." We have aggregates, form, feeling, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, so we are beings who exist. What is worthy of debate, however, is what the convention of a being is, not whether beings exist. Here's where the chariot analogy in the nun story takes center stage, prompting the question, are we like a chariot? An assemblage of parts, the five aggregates, a bunch of forms, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousnesses. Amazingly, this one-line chariot analogy gave birth to a very long stream of philosophical discourse. Some 600 years after the Buddha, a monk in the Svaviravada community named Nagasena became famous for answering questions about Buddhism from the Indo-Greek king Milinda. These are recorded in his book, Questions of Milinda. In relation to the Buddhist view of self, Nagasena extended the short chariot analogy recorded in the connected discourses. He asked the king if any of the individual parts of a chariot, or the parts gathered but not assembled, are the chariot, To which the king, of course, repeatedly replied, no. The text reads, "Is the pole the chariot? No, venerable sir. Is the axle the chariot? No, venerable sir. Are the wheels the chariot, the frame, the yoke, the reins, the goad? No, venerable sir." Then he pressed further. "Then is the chariot all these parts together? No, venerable sir. Then is the chariot something apart from these parts? No, venerable sir. Though I ask repeatedly, I can discover no chariot. Chariot is merely a sound. What then is the chariot? You speak falsely, there is no chariot." The king objected, noting that there is a chariot since he rode in it. Nagasena then responded, "It is because of these various parts when they are arranged in a certain way that the designation chariot is used." Nagasena then applied the analogy to himself. In exactly the same way, because of the various constituents of existence, the designation Nagasena is used, but in the ultimate sense, no person is found here. This aligns well with the original connected discourses, and a viable meaning is that what we generally consider as self is the collection of aggregates, not that there is no self. Of course, in an ultimate sense, when the aggregates no longer have hold of us, then there is no active self clinging to the aggregates. There is then no sense of possession. Self is empty, liberated, lost in the experience of nirvana. That's a far cry from saying there is no self. The nun's chariot analogy, extended by Nagasena, can also be understood to reveal a more subtle teaching. If we cannot say any one or more of the five aggregates that this is mine, this I am, this is myself, then if there is a higher self, an Atman, it lies outside our conditioned experiences. That, however, the Buddha refused to discuss, seemingly because it leads to the thicket of views about self, and thus to more contention and suffering. The nun and the Buddha made no comment on what's outside the bubble of our conditioned experiences, and that includes any self that may lie beyond our experience. As we'll discuss further, different views of self arose within the Buddhist community. But first we need to revisit the Buddha's refusal to talk about self. We saw one such verse in the last section. Here's another. "This world, Kachana, a disciple, is for the most part shackled by engagement, clinging, and adherence. But this one with right view, the Buddha, does not become engaged and cling through that engagement and clinging, mental standpoint, adherence, underlying tendency. He does not take a stand about myself. He has no perplexity or doubt that what arises is only suffering arising. What ceases is only suffering ceasing. His knowledge about this is independent of others. It is in this way, Kachana, that there is right view. All exist. The eternalist position, which asserts that self is eternal, Kachana, this is one extreme. All does not exist. The annihilationist position, which asserts that self does not exist, this is the second extreme. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata, the Buddha, teaches the Dharma by the middle. With ignorance as condition, volitional formations come to be. With volitional formations as condition, consciousness. Such is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. But with the remainderless fainting away and cessation of ignorance comes cessation of volitional formations. With the cessation of volitional formations, cessation of consciousness. Such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. Here it is clear that the Buddha did not take a stand on self because clinging to a view leads to suffering. He did, however, steer a middle path between the extremes of asserting that self is eternal or that self doesn't exist. As to this middle way, It simply focused on ending the conditions which lead to suffering in this world. We can assume that clinging to speculations about self is one of these. The Buddha did, however, unceasingly advocate against saying, "This is mine, this I am, this is myself." Why? The answer may be found in his teachings on conceit. Bhikkhus, that is monks, I am is an involvement with conceit. I am this is an involvement with conceit. I shall be is an involvement with conceit. I shall not be is an involvement with conceit. I shall consist of form is an involvement with conceit. I shall be formless is an involvement with conceit. I shall be percipient, that is perceiving, is an involvement with conceit. I shall be non-percipient, non-perceiving, is an involvement with conceit. I shall be neither percipient nor non-percipient is an involvement with conceit. Involvement with conceit is a disease. Involvement with conceit is a tumor. Involvement with conceit is a dart. Therefore, bhikkhus, you should train yourself thus. We will dwell with a mind in which conceit has been struck down. Thus should you train yourself. It's easy to see a wisdom in this. As soon as one claims an identity or a status, that sets one apart from others and can become the basis for conceit, which can damage both oneself and society. In addition, as the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh taught in his School of Interbeing, it's an illusion to think that we are independent and can claim anything as being exclusively from or for ourselves. Everything we are comes from interaction with others. We interbe with the universe. It's not that we don't exist, it's that we don't own anything. That's why, at least in an earthly sense, we should translate Anatman as not self, not no self. Ultimately, however, there may be no self. The Buddha taught that the 5 aggregates are empty of self. This may mean, as many Buddhists believe, that our true nature is empty of self, but full of the joys of nirvana, which through meditative practices we can get a foretaste of in this world. The view that there is both a conventional self and ultimately no self, a self empty of the sense of possession, is a middle way of sorts, neither denying a self nor affirming that it is eternal, not because the beliefs are wrong, but because clinging to them causes suffering. While the Buddha resisted stating his views about self, nowhere in the Theravada scripture can we find a statement that there is no self. He was, however, not shy in criticizing the claims of ascetics and Brahmins who did make claims about self or no self. In the next section of our in-depth look at the concept of Anatman, we'll explore some fascinating insights in the Buddha's talk about the thicket of views about self and the afterlife.